Yep.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Atta Jack, and I'm an Oglala Lakota from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and right now we're at the Restoration Church in Pine Ridge, and I'm here today to give American history from a Native American Christian perspective, and I thank you for listening to me. And one of the things that I really like to emphasize is that we need to hear a Native American perspective, and I'm not highly educated. I'm a high school graduate, but I believe that we need to hear the history of the Native American from a Native American. So I'll begin right now. It all started probably back in 1492. You've all heard the story of Columbus. And Columbus basically was sent by Spain to search for a new way to India. But 1492, a lot of other things also happened. The Spanish Inquisition began. And a lot of the Jews were burned at the stake and forced to accept Catholicism. And you guys all know the story where Columbus kind of got lost and he ended up in the West Indies. Well, I'm going to give you the North American, Native American version. And we basically in North America, we first had contact with the white European in the early 1600s. And the first settlers who came to Plymouth Rock, they basically came to escape that persecution by the church, which began earlier before in 1492. And they came forward, many of them were Quakers and Pilgrims, and they were searching, and they were also fleeing religious persecution, which is something that we're going to address in a little bit. But, the story, you guys all heard it, the Native Americans helped the Pilgrim, but there's also another story behind it, and there's a Native American by the name of Squanto. And Squanto has a very unique story. Squanto was basically kidnapped and taken to Europe and sold as a slave. And he was bought by some monks, and they bought him with every intention of sending him home. And his stay there with the monks, he actually became a Christian. And lo and behold, they booked him passage back to the New World. And he returned about the same time when the Pilgrims were actually very close to where his home was. And he returned, and his tribe was actually decimated and gone by another tribe. They were gone, and whatever reason they weren't there. And lo and behold, an English-speaking Christian shows up, Native American, and he's the one who showed them how to live off the land, because one of the things that happened was, and it still is that the land was very brutal. And many of the Pilgrims, it said that over half of them starved that first year, and Squanto showed up and basically showed them how to live off the land and to prosper. And you know the story of the Thanksgiving, but a lot of times that's overlooked, that it was actually one man who brought it all into being and brought peace between the white European and the Native American. And many times over the years, the natives and the whites came together. And some of these later the people who were born there were now Americans. The white American as we know them. But the first ones were all European. And the Indians had a very touchy relationship with the white men, and there was different wars. And one of the things that happened is that the Native Americans actually joined in every war that was fought on this continent. Whether the French and Indian War, which a lot of people heard about when France and England fought together, they employed Native Americans on both sides. And one of the things that happened was that once these European powers became, kissed and made up, shook hands, and exchanged lands and gifts or whatever they were fighting for. They exchanged it, but the Native American was seen as hostile because of the things that happened during the war. And the whites forgave one another, but they never forgave the Native American for what he done in the time of war. And many times we became the enemy of the white man, you know. And when they first came, they were very weak, and you know, they were struggling, and we had them outnumbered. And so many of the white Americans, now that I'll call them white Americans because some of them were born here at this time, you know, and many of them made treaties with the Native American, the Indian, the First Nation people, whatever you want to call them. But the indigenous people, they made treaties with them, and many of these treaties were broken as soon as the white Americans became strong enough, you know. And a lot of times their heart turned to greed, you know, and they saw that the Native American land was good, and they also, there was a conquest for gold, and a lot of that was done by the Spaniards who went into South America and Central America. And they found a lot of gold, and they did kill off the Incans, the Mayans, and a lot of these other tribes who were doing some really horrible things, you know. So it was a terrible thing, you know. But you know, in North America, I'm in the North American end of the history, and that's something that I actually want to tell right now, and. You know, so lo and behold, over time, you know, the whites became stronger and stronger and more numerous, and because of the wars, there became more and more hatred between the whites and the Indians, you know, as they came to be known, you know. And like I said, we fought in all of the wars, even the Revolutionary Wars and whatever. We were always, you know, because one of the things that the Native American was very good at was making war. You know, there was very many warrior societies, and the natives were known for their bravery and their almost fearlessness in battle. You know, and many times, you know, and during the time of William Penn, there was actually peace between the Native American and the American people. You know, so it was possible, but many times after this man was no longer in power, that it reverted back to the way it was, you know. And we went through the Revolutionary War, you know, and many of the tribes around that area, you know, they were not equipped to handle I say the sicknesses that were brought from Europe. You know, they had no immunity, and so whole villages just coming in contact with the white man. Many people died from smallpox, you know, cholera, yellow fever, all of these different things, you know. And so sickness actually killed off more natives than anything, you know. And later on, there was a terrible thing, biological warfare that came, you know, where many of the settlers, you know, when people died of smallpox or any of these diseases, they take the blankets and give them to the Indians, and many tribes just totally disappeared from a lot of this biological warfare as it'll come to be known. You know, and many terrible atrocities were done by both sides. You know, and it was a all-around terrible thing. But you know, around the 1800s, you know, there was the Lewis and Clark expedition. They decided to see what was the rest of North America was about, and they actually traveled with a Native American woman who ended up on a dollar, you know, a coin, and her name was Sacagawea, and I'm pretty sure that's not how her name was said in her native language, but you know what I'm talking about. And Lewis and Clark came across at the time when Native Americans didn't know very much about the white man. They heard about them, but many of them, it was the first time they seen them, you know. And they came through the Dakotas and everything else, and you know, they eventually made it to the Pacific Ocean, and they mapped out a lot of things, but that became a thing that was called the westward expansion. And you know, and the thing that really kind of bothered me the most was that at this time there was great revivals, the great awakenings, and all of these different things. And you know, America is very proud of these things because the people really changed. You know, the bars got closed down, and you know, the revival was there. You know, it was something that came forward. But on the other hand, it never reached Native America. You know, there was a great division amongst the native Christian native and the Christian believers. You know, there was, and many of the earlier founding fathers and some of the people who actually, you know, went through the Great Awakening and all these great revivals, they had a great disdain and hatred for the Indian. You know, and they ignored the words of Jesus as seeing every man as better than yourself. And the native was never really truly believed to grasp the concept of the gospel. You know, and they did the exact same thing, you know, what the Catholic Church did during what was known as the Great Dark Ages. You know, they chained the Bible, they kept it from the Native American, and they basically, you know, ruled over them like the priesthood did during the middle of the Dark Ages. And the native was not allowed into any leadership positions. And basically they cut their hair, and they gave them European dress, and they gave them Christian names and called them Christians. You know, and that was the extent of what was known as proselytizing the Native American. You know, and the gospel actually came to only be in that, you know, an outward sign. You know, and as you know, Jesus talked about that. You know, the washing of the outside of the cup, and not worried about the inside. But any person of color at that time, whether he was Chinese out in the Orient, or whether he was the black man or the red man or the brown man, because of his skin color, he was thought as inferior, and he was not thought to be able to grasp that type of knowledge of the gospel and the scriptures. So the scriptures were actually withheld from the Native American, and a very watered down version of the gospel, and basically tried to turn the Native American into a European, you know, by dressing him in that way and cutting his hair, and you know, they basically called it civilizing him, you know, and never mind what was going on spiritually within him. But in spite of all that, you know, some Native Americans actually accepted Jesus Christ and became believers. And in the 1800s, you know, the 5 civilized tribes, they were the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cree, and the Seminole, which basically they were the Indians of the South. You know, not North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, all in that area of the South. You know, they were there. And basically because of great greed, because, you know, Sequoyah, being a Cherokee, was able to make a written language within the span of 3 weeks. He did not want to feel inferior to the white man. And I don't think there's very many people today who could actually sit down and create a language from scratch, you know, by themselves. So this was a very brilliant man, and many of these Native Americans were very good. They owned plantations, they actually owned slaves, they you know, they became prosperous. And one of the things that it did was it brought up great covetousness and jealousy from a lot of white settlers. And their line of thinking was that that's just not right. That some poor white folks don't have all that things, and these red savages, they have all these things. And through deceit and a lot of you know, a lot of bad things happened. You know, the United States government actually took their land, and these Indians actually took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled on their behalf. You know, that's how mismanaged it was and how wickedly it was done. You know, it was straight up something evil. And many of these Native Americans were Christians at the time, you know. And what came to pass was called the Trail of Tears. They were actually loaded up, and they were supposed to be taken by boat up the Mississippi River and into a place called Indian Territory, which was Oklahoma, which was at the time the furthest west that you could put anybody. You know, and but it was during the winter, so they weren't able to do that. So they actually made them walk, and it was called the Trail of Tears because all of the young and all of the old passed away, and all of the weak. Only the very strongest made it, and there was a lot of death and a lot of misery that was equated with it, and it was known as the Trail of Tears. You know, and that was just the beginning. Yeah, that was something. It was called the Manifest Destiny, which basically what happened is that the white American went Old Testament on the Native American, and he decided that the Native American should be wiped out, which was the first act of genocide. You know, it wasn't the first act, but it was a policy of genocide, that the land did belong to the white American, and it was his God-given duty to kill every Indian on the planet and take his land, because after all, they was wasting it. And after all, they're not really human beings anyway. You know, so they justified themselves. They searched the scripture to bend it to fit any way that they seem fit. They actually ignored the teachings of their God, Jesus Christ, you know, the one true God. And they ignored his teachings and went Old Testament. According to Jesus, is that you consider others as better than yourselves, and that all men should hear the gospel. You know, and the preamble of the United States Constitution says that all men are created equal. And we know that the sad fact is that only in the eyes of God are we created equal. You know, but men are very prejudiced, and the heart is deceitful, and it was a terrible time. And they were just a number of many tribes that this happened to. You know, it happened in the Northeast, all the Northeastern tribes. Some of them became Christians, and they were ostracized by their own people, and they were slaughtered by the white settlers. You know, they really had nowhere to go. You know, because once they adopted the white man's God, so-called white man's God, you know, their people turned on them, and there was no sanctuary for them amongst the white people because of this Manifest Destiny policy. That the policy of the United States government was actual genocide. You know, so it was a terrible time. But you know, and then over time, you know, my people, the Lakota, we first met the white man. I'm not talking about the Dakotas who met Lewis and Clark in the early 1800s, you know, at the turn of the century in Minnesota. You know, we were the Plains Indians. You know, we were the ones that all the movies were made out of, you know, that rode the horses, that had the teepee, that fought the cavalry, you know, fought the cowboys, all of these things. All of these stereotypical things that all they attribute to all Native Americans are actually the Plains Indians, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Pawnee, the Crow, so many of them, the Ponca, the Nez Perce. You know, these were the Indians that were glamorized, but we actually met them in 1850 because of something that happened in 1849. Because gold was discovered in California, and every shyster, every person that wanted to get rich, they loaded up and they decided they're going to California, and they'll get there any way possible because they believed that you could just pick the gold up off the ground, and sometimes they did, you know. But the greed was driving it, so that's where my people met them. But I'll get back to that in a little bit. But I'm still talking about the 5 civilized tribes. You know, and they were taken to Oklahoma Territory, and Oklahoma Territory is actually like a prison state, and they brought Indians from all over the country. You know, there's even there's Apaches from the Southwest. Geronimo ended up dying at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. You know, some of there's what they call Southern Cheyennes, and they're actually they're actually taken to Oklahoma, which was called Indian Territory. And you watch the movies where the great land grab, you know, where the people all ran out and they, you know, this land is free, yeah, and they actually gave away the Indian land. And the Louisiana Purchase was actually a sham. It was sold by people who could not occupy the land, you know, because the Indians still owned it at the time, and they fought valiant for it. And you know, the Louisiana Purchase was sold to the Americans, and you know, it was totally illegal, and it was, but you know, the Americans were very proud of buying it from Spain, who actually never owned it. You know, so it was a terrible time in history. But I want to get back to the 5 civilized tribes. Yeah, what happened to them? They actually took all of the South away from them. And you know, within 20 years after doing it, a great travesty, according to the Americans, was the Civil War came. And it was more Americans lost their lives during that, and the South, who lost the war, were actually the war occupied the very land that these 5 civilized tribes owned, and they were greatly chastised. And a lot of what they did to the Native American also came back on them. And when Sherman went through and burned everything to the ground, his scorched the earth policy, and then the carpetbaggers came in and exploited everybody. And you know, it took 100 years for the South to actually come out of that poverty, but the North was actually punished equally, you know, for what they done to the Northwestern and Northeastern Indians and the Iroquois and Chief Pontiac and all of these other Indians who were known as very great and powerful people. And they made treaties with them, and actually by the time that they became more numerous and the Indians started to lose ground, they broke them treaties just as quickly as possible, and they weren't worth the paper that they were written on. You know, and there's a joke around Indian country, you know, that treaty paper and toilet paper are worth the same thing. You know, so it's kind of a joke in Indian territory. The TP could either mean toilet paper or treaty paper, because these treaties weren't worth the paper that they were written on. It's kind of ironic, you know. But one of the things that a lot of times that they did during this treaty is you see that the Indians broke out the peace pipe. It's something that was very sacred to them, and they swore oaths on it. And a lot of these Americans broke out the Bible, and they swore on that which was holy to them. And they broke them, but these things were honoring before God. Yeah, and they're still honored before God. But I'll get back to that. You know, but I'll get back to my people. But also what happened in California was a terrible travesty when all these shysters and every get quick scheme guy ended up in California. There was actually Indians there, and these were not the warriors of the plains or the great warriors on the other side. Many of these were very poor Indians, and they subsided by digging roots and living off the land. They had a very nomadic lifestyle, and they were known to be pitiful, you know, because they were not warlike. They were very peaceful Indians, and they lived off the land, and they didn't have a lot of belongings, and they were very passive, and they were quickly exploited by all of these people, you know, and they enslaved a lot of them and made them work the mines. They killed their children, they stole their women, and they exploited these people. And it was a terrible thing, but after all, they weren't really human. So they justified themselves because of the color of their skin. And they exploited the yellow man at the same time, made him build the railroads, and they really hated him, and they worked for slave wages, and they treated all people of color very badly. You know, even during the Civil War, you know, the bringing the black man into slavery was a very terrible thing. You know, but there was a form of self-righteousness that the lighter-skinned people were superior to anybody of color. And it was very hard you know, the true gospel has never been preached in Native America because of that line of thinking. You know, that you're as a Native American, as a black person, as a yellow person, a person of any color, that you're really not smart enough to understand the gospel, and you're not really a human. We were thought of being as subhuman, you know. And at that time in the 1800s, a very devastating thing called the theory of evolution was coming into being. And one of the things that the evolution taught was that the whiter races were more civilized and advanced. You know, they were higher up on the evolutionary scale. And the darker races were further down and closer to the monkey, you know. And that was actually being taught, you know, that the Aborigines and the black man and the red man and the yellow man were actually further down on the evolutionary scale. And it was devastating, and many people will justify themselves because of that. You know, when you're doing something wrong, you want to justify yourself and help yourself to sleep at night. So you believe that, oh, they're not really human. You know, it's like killing an animal, and they do not deserve any of these things. So it was a very terrible time. And I'll get back to my people, the Lakota. You know, the Treaty of 1850 was called the Fort Laramie Treaty, and basically it said that we owned half of South Dakota, half of North Dakota, a big chunk of Wyoming, a big chunk of Montana, all the way down to Colorado. It was a very big, almost the size of Texas, and it's still being disputed whether or not the Indian owned it, but we were there at Fort Laramie when they came. You know, and we had a wide range of travel that we did, you know, and basically the United States government showed up, and we knew them as the Milahanska, the long knives, because they were soldiers that showed up, you know. And many of them carried the long saber, and they brought the thunder stick, you know, and we made war against them, and Red Cloud had many wars with them. You know, and he fought them to a standstill, and they had to make treaties in order to pass through the land. And they brought gifts, and they brought cattle, and they brought trinkets, and they brought all these things, and they really you know, made the Indian believe that they came with good intentions. You know, and that was one of the things that they did. And they said, well, we're going to pass through your land, and the only thing that we'll leave is two wagon tracks, and we will not touch anything, and we will pay you for everything that we take. You know, and it wasn't very long before they keep breaking these promises, but Red Cloud would ride out and punish them. You know, many of the war chiefs, you know, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, all of them, they joined into these fights, and as long as the fight was fair, the Native American won. You know, because of his great bravery and his great horsemanship and his ability to not fearing battle. You know, it was a great honor to die in the midst of battle. You know, and Crazy Horse used to say, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die." You know, because there was nothing more honorable than die fighting for your people. You know, and it was a great reward to actually be killed in battle. You were known as a great warrior, and you were valiant. And so many of the men were, you know, and they were fighting for their way of life. They were fighting for their women and children. They were fighting for their land. They were fighting for all of these things. You know, they were, and so to say, they were the first Homeland Security, and they were the first terrorism task force that was out there. You know, and they fought valiantly, but over time, you know, after the great battle between the white men, known as the Civil War, which I just talked to you about, you know, all of a sudden, all of the resources of the United States government was turned into these Indian wars, and it was known as the Indian Wars. And basically, they could not match the native battle for battle, so they came up with a new plan, and that plan was to decimate the buffalo. And because the buffalo was food, shelter, clothing to the Native American. It was basically our economy, and they collapsed our economy. And you know, there was stories of, you know, the men riding in trains and just shooting the buffalo down, and they skinned them, took the hide and took the tongue, you know, which was a delicacy, and they left the rest of the animal to rot. And they killed off. There was millions upon millions of buffaloes by the turn of the turn of the 19th, end of the, you know, beginning of the 19th century. There was less than a few thousand buffalo. I don't even remember. They might even been down to hundreds. You know, but that's how far they'd estimated it. But what came into being was that starvation came to Indian territory. You know, the Indian could no longer go out and hunt because what he relied upon for food was dead now, and there wasn't enough game, and the white men kept coming. And you know, Chief Red Cloud himself, who took a trip into Philadelphia and New York, and he saw the massive amounts of white people, and you know, he knew the days were numbered. He saw the writing on the wall. And Chief Red Cloud actually had a bad reputation because of that. Many people considered him a sellout, but I know for a fact that Red Cloud actually helped to maintain the reservation, you know, and he had a very good friendship with the Indian agents, and he was a very good politician, but he was unpopular with the people, you know, and it was a terrible time, you know. But we had very many good battles. You know, 1870s came, and one of the things that happened was a young upstart general by the name of General Armstrong Custer, who came out of the Civil War with field honors of a general, and he was demoted to a lieutenant. You know, he was demoted down from a general to the next level. You know, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. You know, but this was something that happened, and he actually had ambitions to become the president of the United States. And his campaign promise was that he was going to ride through the Great Sioux Nation, give him a couple hundred men, and he'd ride through the Sioux Nation, and nobody would be able to stop him. Well, they put that to the test at the Battle of Greasy Grass, which is known by the white people as the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And he did have his 200 men, and he did ride into the Great Sioux Nation, also the Cheyenne and the Arapaho who were there, and he was quickly decimated, you know, by these warriors. But the whole 7th Cavalry was not wiped out. 1/3 of them actually survived, and they lived through it. And history kind of plays it out that they were all killed, but they was not. You know, but that was a great battle to the Native American. But it was also the end of it. You know, from that time on, that was the last great battle. But one of the things that Custer did that was detrimental to our people was that he led an illegal expedition into the Black Hills, the Pahasapa. And he led that illegal expedition into the Black Hills, and he found gold. And now the Treaty of 1868 and everything else, they threw it out the window. And people got greedy, and they actually went into the Black Hills. And Black Hills is known for having the biggest gold mine ever. It's called the Homestake Gold Mine, and it's still in the Black Hills. But the thing about it is it's empty. It's a big hole in the ground. And last I heard, they were trying to do deep underground experiments because that's all it's worth. You know, but they came and decimated our people, and they took all the land that they could, and they stripped the Black Hills. You know, and it was a terrible time. And the 1880s came, you know, but one of the things that happened was all of the great chiefs, all of the male leadership and the true chiefs were being wiped out. You know, Crazy Horse, they tricked him into going to Fort Robinson in Nebraska, and they told him that he would not be incarcerated. And he did not want to give up, but he turned around and he saw that his people were starving, and he could not bear that. So he turned himself in, and he went to, you know, Fort Robinson, and lo and behold, that amnesty that they promised him was not true. And when they tried to take him to the Iron House to lock him up, he resisted, and he was summarily bayoneted in the back by a white soldier as one of his friends tried to stop him, little big man, and he was bayoneted and he died. He was taken by his people, but he was known as the greatest war chief among our people because he never surrendered. Well, in the time that he was surrendering, he was knifed in the back and he was left to die. And it was a terrible time, and the people's hearts were broke because of it. And many other the war chiefs were killed in that way. You know, and these so-called paper chiefs were put into place, and basically all they were yes men. They were men of ill repute, and they put them up as chiefs so that they could sign the treaties that gave away a lot of the land. And these weren't the true chiefs that the people respected. You know, so it was a terrible time, and you know, it was a time when the Old West was glorified. You know, all the cowboy movies and the gunfights and down the street in Dodge City and in Deadwood and all of these places. But all of these places at one time were Indian country, and at the time the Indians were open season. You know, the policy of the United States government was still eradication, which is genocide. They were shoot on sight. You know, you saw Indian, you shot him on sight. You know, and that was the policy of the United States government, and they broke every treaty. And by the end of the 1880s, you know, all of the Indian tribes were now put on reservations, and a reservation was a very terrible thing. You know, and it was, and later on, a man named Adolf Hitler would model concentration camps after it because he loved the ideal of what the United States did to the Native American. And he decided that he's going to do the same thing to the Jews, the Poles, the Gypsies, and anybody undesirable. And it was a terrible thing. You know, but the Native American, well, basically, it was a time of when they were grasping at straws. And one of the things that happened in the late 1880s was that there was a false prophet, a false prophet, I will call him, because his name was Wovoka. And how do you know a false prophet? Because he prophesies things that do not come true. That's the test of the Bible. If a man prophesies something that does not come true, he's a false prophet. And Wovoka was actually a Paiute Indian, and he had enough Christianity and Mormonism to make him dangerous. You know, and he basically brought forth a religion which was modeled after the millennial. You know, but it was a Christless millennial, which made it very dangerous. And the Indians, grasping at straws and hoping for anything, bought into it. And the Indians in the Pine Ridge Reservation and other reservations, they sent emissaries down to meet with this man. And they basically, he taught them how to make the ghost dance shirt, and he claimed that what he claimed was that this shirt would make them impervious to the white man's bullets, but also that when they did this dance and they went into their trance and they wore these shirts, that the ground would open up and swallow the white man, and out of that same hole in the ground that the white man disappeared into, that all the buffalo would come back, and all those who died would be resurrected. And what's not to like about that? You know, a lot of the Native Americans put their hope into it. You know, because I believe that they never really truly heard the gospel. You know, and they were never welcome to it. But it all culminated it came to a head in Bullhead, North Dakota, and a man who we all know as Sitting Bull, he was the ghost dance was going on, and Sitting Bull didn't really believe in the ghost dance, but they came forward and they accosted him and they tried to arrest him for being a leader of the ghost dance. And Sitting Bull but had enough. He was an old man, and he fought all his life, and he was tired of running, and he decided he ain't going down without a fight. And he was gunned down by the tribal police on behalf of the United States government. You know, and a chief named Bigfoot heard about this, and he knew that his days were numbered. So a lot of Sitting Bull's followers, you know, went behind the leadership of Bigfoot, and they actually left the reservation. And the reason why that they walked to Pine Ridge was a very interesting reason. You know, because there was some Southern Cheyennes who I talked about earlier that were shipped to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. You know, and they were Cheyennes, and they missed the mountain regions of Montana where they were from, and they actually escaped from the reservation in Oklahoma, and they made it as far as Fort Robinson, and they holed up there. And Red Cloud, being great friends with the Indian agents, he actually granted them sanctuary. And there are Cheyennes to this day. There's actually a little community about 1.5 miles out north of Pine Ridge called Cheyenne Creek, and where the Cheyennes set up camp. And Bigfoot, hearing this, actually decided that, you know, his only chance of survival and his people's survival was to make it down to Pine Ridge, where Red Cloud would grant them sanctuary. And they actually did this in the middle of winter. They left in December, in late November, which anybody who knows the Dakotas, and that this is blizzard season and it gets bitterly cold. But they were so desperate that they took off on foot, and what little horses they had, and they had a lot of women and children, and Bigfoot himself was very sick. He was dying of pneumonia. And close to Porcupine Butte, where Keeley radio station is, they were accosted by the 7th Cavalry, which was Custer's old unit. You know, and there was a lot of hard feelings, and they were taken to Wounded Knee Creek, and they were brought there. But you know, our brothers, the Cheyenne, they had their own Wounded Knee, you know, and it was called the Sand Creek Massacre, and it was actually happened in Colorado. And the sad fact that gives Christianity a black eye is that the man who led this attack was actually a pastor. And he basically led this attack against, and Chief Black Kettle actually stood under a flag of a truce and waved an American flag that he believed that they'd see the flag and they'd honor all of their promises, and he was gunned down on the spot. And if you ever watched the movie Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman, that is not Wounded Knee that is happening there. That is the Sand Creek Massacre, what they did to the Cheyenne. And they gunned down the men, women, and children who stood under the flag of truce, and they were supposedly to be protected by the United States government, and they stood under the United States flag. And it was a terrible time, but getting back to the Wounded Knee story, you know, so Bigfoot and his band were actually taken to Wounded Knee Creek, and the next morning they were disarmed. And while they were being disarmed, it is said that one of the men there was deaf, and they tried to take away a knife that he had, and he resisted, not knowing what they were saying or what they were doing. And it didn't take very much, you know. The tension was so much that any little thing set it off, and basically gun was fired and all hell broke loose. And the Indians were actually caught in a crossfire, and they were gunned down. You know, and the army had a new gun. It was actually called a Hotchkiss gun, it was an artillery round that it was much like the grape shot, but it was like a giant cannon that was easy to reload. And it was used against the Native American, and they gunned down a lot of them. And you know, there was they do not know exactly how many people are buried there. You know, there was somewhere between 150, 200 people out of a band of about 300 people who went forward. And if you look at the pictures, they're probably floating on the internet, and they show a lot of the people that they're taking pictures and they're laying at odd angles. And the reason why they're laying at odd angles, especially the picture of Bigfoot, is that many of them were shot in the back while they were running, and they fell down face first, and they died with the face to the ground. But to make the picture look better, they flip them over while they were frozen, and they took pictures, and there was like 24 medals of honor that were given, for people behaving valiantly beyond the call of duty. They behaved valiantly when they were gunning down a lot of unarmed women and children, and it was a terrible time. And that happened in the late 1890s, and it was actually known as the final battle of the Great Indian Wars, which began about almost 400 years earlier. So it was a terrible time for us, and the Native American was basically forgotten. And many people believe that all of them were decimated, and that was the ideal. Every now and then, Wild Bill Cody would bring some of the old chiefs out, some of the Indians, and go on tour with his Wild West show, and and it was highly glorified. All these dime store novels, and it was a novel thing. The Indians were getting gunned down, and they were just terrible people, and But the turn of the century came, and the Indian was forgot about, but lo and behold, that something came up, about 15 years at the turn of the century, and it was called World War I. And World War I came, and guess what? What happened was many of these Native Americans who were only good at one thing, and that was making war, they jumped at the chance to go fight overseas against the Germans. They enlisted for a country that did not want them or did not acknowledge them. They enlisted, and they went to, the overseas to fight these wars. And they fought in the trenches. And they came home, and they were honored because of it. And they were honored so much that in 1925, that the first American became the last one invited to become American citizens. And the first became the last. And it was ironic, and all of a sudden, that the native who's always been there and who was the first American was finally called an American citizen, because we did not have, but things didn't change very much because of that. The Indian could not leave the reservation without a kind of hall pass from the agents, and a lot of times if he was cut off the reservation by so-called settlers, they could gun him down, and there was no repercussions for them. There was no law against killing an Indian. And some of the signs in scenic South Dakota actually said, "No Indians or dogs allowed," because the Indians were not allowed into these stores, and they were thought of being as subhuman. It was a real terrible time. And the Indian actually, and by some accounts, by some of the older white folks that lived around here, they actually said that in the 1920s on the reservation that the Great Depression began there first, and that the Indians were in deep poverty and deep drought even before the rest of the nation followed through. And the 1930s came, and it was a terrible time. And many people were brought into poverty. But it took another great war to bring them out of poverty. And lo and behold, 1940s, America joined the rest of the world in the war to end all world, the second one, the war to end all wars. And once again, the Native American, he came forward and he enlisted in the armed services, and he actually fought violently. And one of the things that came out of it is that the code talkers, that they actually, came up with a code that the Japanese couldn't break. And many of these Native Americans, because they had no knowledge that the Native American was even alive, much less had a language, and so many of the Native Americans, joined into these fights. They fought the South Seas, they fought in Germany, they fought in Italy, they fought in very many places. And when I was a young man, a lot of these vets were still there, and they were really hard men. You know, they've been in battle, and they seen terrible things, and they done terrible things. But they did it for a country which still did not acknowledge them or give them any credit. They still were, the so-called Jim Crow laws that they had of the South were actually still being enforced around all the reservations. Like I told you, no Indians or dogs allowed. And a lot of the positions as agents were actually political appointments. And they were given to certain people knowing that they would rip off the Indian, that they would steal the beef that came, and they would sell the flour, and it was a very lucrative business, and the Indian starved many times because of it. You know, but it was a political appointment, and they were expected to rip off the Indian. And that was one of the things that World War II ended, and all of a sudden the United States became booming. You know, it's called the greatest economic development of the United States. You know, but it wasn't for us. You know, but one of the things that came in the 1950s, you know, there was a policy that a lot of Indians did not know or understand, but it was called relocation. The late 50s and early 60s was a time where they decided that the Indian, they were going to pay for his training, and they were going to send him into the cities. And they sent him into Chicago, Detroit, LA, Denver, you know, any of these big cities. And a lot of the Indians, you know, got jobs there. But what they didn't count on was that the Indian wasn't very happy there. He liked having the money, and he liked having the job. But what good was it without your family and without your people? You know, so a lot of them returned home, and that was something that they did not expect. But the policy was to shut down the reservation, and they thought that, oh, if we let the Indian go and join the great melting pot, and if he finds a job, he'll be happy, because everybody else was centered around making money, and that was their main motivation. But the Indian needed his identity. You know, he needed his people, or else he was not happy, and we're still like that today. You know, we need our own kind, and we need our own people. So it was, but that came and went, and in the 1960s it was going full string. But also something else happened. It was the civil rights movement, and it happened in the South and other places. You know, and the Martin Luther King and a lot of the black people and different people who were with them marched and gave their lives up for civil rights. But as Indians, the first were also last again. And in the 1970s, we had our civil rights movement. And it was because of something that happened during the 1960s. And there was a policy to shut down the reservations. And the government wanted to shut down the reservations, and they were tired of their fiduciary responsibilities to the Indian. And they no longer wanted to pay the Indian for all of the land and everything that was taken from him. And they wanted to abolish the reservations, and they wanted the Native American to go into the great melting pot of the United States government. I mean, that's the United States. But it didn't work so well. You know, one of the things is that they bred a lot of evil things. They manipulated, alcohol was weaponized against the Native American, and some of these great and honorable chiefs, once they got drunk, they sold their land, they sold their wives, they sold their children, and that's how terrible the alcohol, and they used alcohol to enslave the Indian. And they also used a lot of other things, ignorance. A lot of times they'll go, if an Indian wouldn't sell his land, they'd go to his neighbor or a close relative and buy the land, give them money for someone else's land. It was a terrible thing. You know, so the Indian was kind of catching on, you know, that the white man speaks with forked tongue, and that we shouldn't trust the United States government. We have no reason to. And basically they had an ideal to eradicate the reservations. And here in the Pine Ridge Reservation, where the civil rights movement actually came to the head, And one of the things that some of the older people will remember is back in the 1960s, that during the Kennedy administration, they were bringing grant money into here. And they actually built a moccasin factory, a fish hook factory, and they made a few small farms. You know, and that was grant money, and they were going to get the Indian back on his feet. You know, because one of the things that the United States was known about was their humanitarian, so-called humanitarian efforts. You know, and one of the things that they rebuilt Germany twice, they rebuilt Europe twice, they rebuilt Japan, they rebuilt the South, they rebuilt all of these things, but the Native America was never once rebuilt. And never once was industry brought in or anything, or training. They basically put the Indian on the reservation to rot and to die. And like I said, Adolf Hitler took notice of that, and he expounded on it. And he took those very same policies that the United States government had, and he used it against his undesirables. And he, when it was all said and done, he killed 6 million people. But that was not even nearly the amount of people that were killed in North America and South America by the white Europeans. And I really believe that the America was punished during the Civil War, what they did to the Indians, and then Europe was punished during the World War I and World War II for the amount of Indian lives that were lost, you know, because of their policies and their greed. And Europe went into these great battles, and they lost hundreds of millions, you know, 100 million people. And that's probably equal to the amount of people that were lost in North America and South America. You know, and God being a just God, he requires justice. He's a God of justice. And the Native American may not know it, but I do believe that God dealt out some justice against America and also the European nations who exploited her. You know, and there was a life for a life. You know, and many people lost their lives. And the scary thing that we have to remember is that the United States is still in the business of genocide. They're one of the most dangerous places on earth is in the mother's womb in the United States of America, because it's believed that 1 out of every 5 children who is in the woman's womb, that's supposed to be the safest place, is actually killed there. You know, and the numbers say that 60 million Americans have lost their lives due to that abortion. And God requires a life for a life. And I don't think he's going to hold the people who actually had the abortion, but the people who made it policy. And some of these people did not have abortions, but they approved of these abortions, and they actually pushed the Roe versus Wade forward. You know, I think and actually abortion is a form of genocide, and it was actually instituted to remove the undesirables, the brown skin, the poor, and the mentally retarded, and the mentally people who they felt wasn't smart enough to be Americans. And that was actually the push. And we should not be deceived into anything more. But there will be a call for a life for life. You know, and what that means is 1 out of every 5 Americans will probably lose their life in the upcoming next few years. You know, because God will abandon this nation, you know, for what they're doing. You know, they've taken it, God's once providential protection, and America's stance with Israel a lot of times protected them, but that's all changing now. You know, and God being a just God, he's been merciful and long-suffering and patient and waiting for that repentance that never came. You know, and people will justify themselves, and you know, it's not really death. And I feel sad for the American Christian who is not outraged by the tapes that just came out, where they're actually selling body parts and they're laughing about it. And and you know, they don't want to call it what it is. It's murder, and it's selling of human organs. And it's a terrible, and yet they want to point fingers at the black market where people will steal organs off a living person. you know, and America's outrage against all these other countries is a farce, because all of these countries know what America did to the Native American, and they never invited them forward, you know. But getting back to the 1960s, you know, there was a push to actually rebuild North America, Indian country, and it was a very feeble push. Not their fiduciary responsibilities, that, you know, and they say we don't owe the native anything, but all of the wealth that was taken from this land, which remember this, that America no longer owns. You know, that wealth that you stole from the Native Americans, welcome to the club. It's been done to you. You know, and there is no middle class, and you know, and we owe so much money. All of us collectively owe so much money to the Chinese and all these great big banks that you actually bankrupted. You actually sold everything that we own. It didn't even belong to you. It was still ours, and you actually bankrupted it, and you squandered it. And there was a push to get out of those fiduciary responsibilities, and you know, and the Indian wisened up by the 1970s, and you know, there was the Wilson administration, and Dick Wilson actually was trying to be progressive, you know, and be wary of that word progressive, because it makes it sound like you're going somewhere. In actuality, you're not, you know. But he was a progressive, and he decided that it was time for the Oglala Sioux tribe to go forward and be welcomed into the 20th century. And a man by the name of Chief Frank Foolscrow led a grassroots people, and they didn't know else what to do. So they asked some activists out of Minneapolis, which was called the American Indian Movement, to come down and represent them. But the American Indian movement was not the force behind it. The actual force behind it was the Oglala Vietnam veterans who came down, and you know, a lot of them went AWOL, and these were battle-hardened men who fought in Southeast Asia, and they knew all the guerrilla warfare tactics, and they fought against Charlie, and they did valiantly. And a lot of them came home when they heard what was going on, and one of the things that you see at these Native American gatherings is the upside down flag. You know, and there's others that are using it now, but the upside down flag means that the country is in distress. And so these Native Americans, and I have an uncle who actually went AWOL from Fort Carson, and he was discharged from Army. A lot of these men were discharged. Some of them got out honorably, and they still had enough battle. They were battle hardened, and there was a civil war that happened here in Pine Ridge, you know. And there was these Native American, the American Indian movement, but the soldiers out of the American Indian movement were Vietnam veterans, you know, Webster, Porbear, and a few others to name. You know, I can't name them off the top of my head. You know, I'm doing all of this off the top of my head because it's our tradition to be able to stand up and, as oral people, relay oral history. You know, but a lot of these people went forward, and some of them gave their lives. And we had the highest murder rate of any place in the United States at that time. You know, and there was fighting in the streets. I remember there was shootouts. There was booby traps. There was the National Guard would shoot off flares every night, and to actually light up everything to see where everybody was at. And there was, you know, but the Wilson administration had a vigilante group, and they were called the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, and basically they were known as the Goon Squad. And you know, Wilson basically he thought he was doing the right thing, you know. And they say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, Dick Wilson did have good intentions, but he was on the wrong side of history when it was all said and done, you know. But one of the things that what the cost was is that Native America gives up their land, and they give up their sovereignty. They once again, the United States government was asking for more land, and that we would become part of the state, which would not be beneficial to us. And a lot of the older people and the traditionals realize that we can't afford to do this. You cannot be a sovereign nation, which we claim, without a land base. And they were willing to give up the land base for grant money to move into the 20th century. You know, once again, poverty was used against the Native American. And the Native American fought valiantly, but something came up that was used during Vietnam. The media was actually there when the Native Americans once returned to where the last battle of the Indian Wars was taking place in Wounded Knee, and they actually captured Wounded Knee. They took over. They came and they looted the trading post, and they burned it down. And they went up and took over the grave site and actually set up bunkers, and they armed themselves and prepared for the onslaught of the United States government. And they did show up. You know, the National Guard and the FBI and the Marshals and the Goon Squad and all of these came to attack. And they would have decimated, did whatever they wanted, but there was something that was different there at that time. The media was there, and the whole world was watching. And the United States government could not do what it ordinarily do in secret. It was out in the open, and they could not attack these people and kill them as they so desired. But there was a standoff, and there actually was a truce that was being made, but that was not the end of it. There was about 2 more years of civil war that followed, where the United States government actually used the U.S. Marshals and the FBI and the Goon Squad. They armed them to fight against the American Indian movement, whose major force was Vietnam veterans. And two of the major things that came from Wounded Knee and the standoff was, the first was the Indian Child Welfare Act. It's called ICWA, and what it said was that as Native Americans, we were now able to care for our orphans and children that usually ordinarily would be given to white families when they were removed from Native American families. They were placed in white families, and one of the things that happened was that they grew up in these white families, and they were offered everything that these people could give them. But you know, something goes wrong with it. You know, that a lot of these people, these kids, when they grew up, they're prone to violence. You know, they're depressed, and a lot of them turn to alcoholism and promiscuity. You know, because there's a mourning deep within their soul, a mourning that is within their very, very soul. You know, so, but they allowed us now to step up to the plate and actually care for our own. But the second thing that came out of it was called the Native American Religious Freedom Act. And the irony of the Native American Religious Freedom Act was that what I stated in the beginning was that the first white Europeans who came here were seeking religious freedom, and they were running away from the tyranny of the Catholic Church and other entities that were trying to, you know, squash them. But the Native American, he was now given self-determination, and that he can now have religious freedom to choose as he saw fit. You know, so once again, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And you know, one of the things that I'm looking forward to is that finally that the true gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ, can now be preached, you know, and can be received. And you know, I recommend that all Native people will look into it themselves. You know, not take someone's word for it, but investigate it for themselves and make that choice of who actually is God. Don't go by the cliches, oh, the white man's God, and all these other things that people throw out there without investigating. And you know, don't take someone else's word for it, but investigate it. You know, and I really do believe in my heart that you know, Jesus Christ is the answer. You know, that through the power of the Holy Spirit, that we will be able to change our nation, that we will be able to be the once great people that we were, you know, and continue to be. and that we could go from being the worst and you know, the poorest and all of these other things that, you know, that will live in infamy, but that we will show you know, that we will provoke the American church into jealousy and actually to get back on the right path from which they strayed. And I believe that it is the Native American Christians' destiny to actually humiliate the American church for their slothfulness and their false doctrine, but also to take it to the ends of the earth. You know, we desire to send disciples. You know, we desire to raise up some of our own, and that they could go forth and preach the gospel to the nations and fulfill the Great Commission of taking it to the utmost parts of the earth. And I really do believe this, and this is the vision that I believe I'm trying to bring forward. You know, but the one thing that I want to stress is that, you know, God has not forsaken us, and He has chastised the Americans and the Europeans on our behalf. You know, and that he still desires and yearns for us to return to Him. You know, I believe that it was His plan from the beginning to reveal Himself to us, but you know, He got lost in translation, and human nature actually, you know, came against all of the work of the Lord had planned for us. And I really encourage you to you know, investigate it for yourself. Don't let someone else make this judgment for you, but to check it out for yourself. And you know, and I do believe that all the things that we believe and all the things that we desire to be are supernatural, and we need the power of the Holy Spirit to do these things. So, you know, so I encourage you, and I pray for you that these things will happen. And I thank you for giving me your time, and I hope that you will learn from this, and I hope that you investigate a lot of what I said and see if it's true for yourself. You know, don't just take my word for it. You know, check it out for yourself. Thank you. Appreciate it.